Biden said in his speech yesterday, "We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it had always been: preventing a terrorist attack on American homeland." First of all, I hate that nationalistic jingoism, homeland, but that's what y'all's president said yesterday in his speech about the inevitable unfolding chaos in Afghanistan. And the man was belligerent, I think, in saying the quiet part about U.S. imperialism in the country out loud. He might as well have stood at the podium and said, "We went into Afghanistan for payback against the terrorists we helped create when we used the Afghan people to fight the Soviet Union in the 80s, and that's all we cared about. We did that, and to hell with them people and their country." Then Biden had the unmitigated and repulsive gall to blame the Afghans for not fighting for their country, for their future. He said those words, and I can't even say what I really want to right here, but let's never, ever forget that by the time Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, by the way, not Afghanistan, 10 years after the U.S. invasion into the country, Afghanistan had been ravaged by war, and U.S. operations that were supposed to include reconstruction efforts weren't, because the U.S. did not seriously plan for it, not with the requisite manpower, not with the proper understanding of the politics of the country, not with the proper planning, not with the concern for the people of Afghanistan at all. It's Charlie Wilson's war all over again. Instead, the CIA, Washington politicians, U.S. military experts decided to centralize a U.S.-fashioned government in Kabul instead, and threw duffel bags and suitcases full of money at all those corrupt leaders who had as little in common with most of the people in Afghanistan as the U.S. military and contractors and mercenaries manipulating them did. And then the despicable arrogance of Biden, dismissing the Afghan people as cowards or as too stupid to fight by saying, "We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future." Oh, my God, that is horrifically devoid of any historical accuracy whatsoever. I told you yesterday that the Afghan people were struggling for their own self-determination, but the U.S. had to seize on that internal struggle to wage a proxy war against the Soviet Union. Biden said that they don't have the will to fight. The Afghan people have fought every interloper that came into their country that thought they would have a say in Afghanistan's affairs, and the Afghans sent all of them packing. They didn't have the will to fight? Man, the ahistorical white supremacist nerve of that man is, I can barely take it. And remember that the U.S. threw together an army in Afghanistan pretty much like they threw together the government. They pulled together the literal survivors of foreign wars in their country, the war-weary people whose cultures and beliefs the U.S. mocked, derided, dismissed, and had no interest in truly learning about. And instead of providing regional material support to people to rebuild their communities, the U.S., in its infinite wisdom, armed those folks and told them to fight against the enemy that the U.S. pointed them toward, which was the enemy that the U.S. helped create in the first place. And the military brass and super smart consultants and CIA spooks and highly paid government hitmen, a.k.a. mercenaries, and the slick politicians in Washington thought the Afghan people in that army were too stupid to know this. So, of course, Biden's speech oozed with the hateful contempt that the U.S. military had for Afghans that was exposed by the Afghanistan papers that were published in 2019. In those documents, it was revealed that U.S. officials, quote, depicted the Afghan security forces as incompetent, unmotivated, poorly trained, corrupt, and riddled with deserters and infiltrators. But it turns out It actually wasn't the Afghan forces that were corrupt and inept and poorly trained. It was the U.S. forces that were supposed to be training them. And do we seriously believe those Afghan people didn't know how much the U.S. military absolutely loathed them? This man stood at that podium last night and said that he told Afghan officials that, quote, Afghanistan should prepare to fight their civil wars after the U.S. military departed to clean up the corruption in government so the government can function for the Afghan people. Oh, the civil war the U.S. helped fuel after the U.S. armed mujahideen pushed the Red Army out of the country, the corruption the U.S. government enabled by propping up greedy leaders who the U.S. paid with suitcase full of U.S. dollars. And then Biden said, the events we're seeing now are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a stable, united, secure Afghanistan, as known in history as the graveyard of empires. Graveyard of empires. There's that despicable, dehumanizing phrase again. But of course, Biden would say it without thinking that he's relegating the whole country to a place where nothing worth anything lives, as if it were not the people living in that country who sent empires running from their borders with their tails between their legs. And for the millionth time, it is not the job of outside military forces from other countries to make another country stable or united. Oh, the arrogance of American imperialist exceptionalism is just too much right now. Listen, let me be clear. I'm not at all arguing here that Biden should have kept troops in Afghanistan. That is a false response to pointing out the obvious outcome of U.S. imperialism. This is what U.S. imperialism always creates. And being honest about this is not the same as saying we want U.S. troops to stay in a country and continue imperialism. No, we need to be far more mature in the way we have these discussions, not resorting to ridiculous comebacks when U.S. imperialism is criticized like, oh, so you want the troops to stay? No, I do not. What I want, what every real anti-imperialist wants, is for the crimes of this empire to be exposed and for the figurehead of the empire to not get away with those crimes by blaming the people in the crosshairs of the empire, in this case, the Afghan people. The truth is, there was no failure in Afghanistan. This was the only conclusion possible to the U.S. policy that was explained by Biden in the beginning of his speech, to protect the U.S. from the threat of terrorism on our shores, the terrorism that the U.S. helped to create in the country of Afghanistan. And the empire did that knowing full well that they had created terrorists and were terrorists on someone else's shores themselves. Biden just carried on the tradition of being U.S. imperialism's defender-in-chief at the expense of the Afghan people that U.S. imperialism has terrorized for more than 40 years. Follow Luqman Nation on patreon.com/LuqmanNation for lots of great content.